In a packed university lecture hall, Professor Alden Whitfield mocks the department's diversity admissions program and bets $50,000 that no black student in the room can solve his unsolved signature equation, singling out quiet junior Malik Turner. We go back to Malik's small apartment the night before, revealing he was raised by his mother after his father, a brilliant mathematician, died under strange professional circumstances decades earlier, leaving behind a worn notebook filled with unfinished proofs. The university's prestigious mathematics department is introduced in cinematic detail. A grand lecture hall, portraits of past department chairs on the walls, wealthy donors' names etched into plaques, and a rigid academic hierarchy. Malik is mocked for his background and assumed unprepared, dismissed by classmates' snickers, while Whitfield performs confidence for the room and a visiting donor committee. Flashback beats reveal Whitfield has a pattern of undermining minority and scholarship students, quietly steering them out of advanced coursework, protected by a dean who values his fundraising connections. A teaching assistant named Priya, who has quietly supported Malik for 2 years, reveals she has seen this pattern before and hints at something buried in the department's own history. Whitfield publicly humiliates Malik further, threatening to fail him and have him removed from the honors program if he wastes the department's time attempting the equation. We learn Malik's late father, a gifted mathematician named Elijah Turner, once submitted foundational work toward this very equation decades earlier while a graduate student under Whitfield's own mentor, work that mysteriously disappeared from the record. The university's provost, alerted by Priya through official channels, enters the lecture hall accompanied by the department's archivist just as Malik begins his solution. Malik solves the equation with an elegant single chalk line insight passed down through his father's old notebook, and the provost reveals archival proof that Elijah Turner's original unpublished work was the true foundation of Whitfield's celebrated signature equation. Villain collapse plus justice. Whitfield's reputation and career unravel publicly as the plagiarism and decades of quiet discrimination come to light, and the department is forced to formally credit Elijah Turner's legacy. Months later, Malik is awarded a named scholarship in his father's honor. Priya is promoted, the department reforms its mentorship practices, and the story closes with an emotional message and YouTube call to action. $50,000 says not one of our diversity admits in this room can solve it. Prove me wrong. Professor Alden Whitfield's voice rang out across the packed lecture hall, confident and theatrical, as he underlined a dense equation sprawled across the chalkboard behind him. His so-called signature equation, a problem he had built his entire academic reputation around for the past 15 years, one he claimed no student had ever come close to solving in his classroom. A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the room. Several students exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure whether to laugh along or stay silent. Near the back of the hall, a visiting delegation of university donors sat in reserved seats, watching the exchange with the mild, detached amusement of people accustomed to elite institutions performing exactly this kind of confident spectacle for their benefit. In the third row, Malik Turner sat very still, his pencil resting motionless against his notebook. He was a junior in the university's honors mathematics program, quiet by nature, and had spent the better part of 2 years trying not to draw unnecessary attention to himself in a department where he often felt like the only person in the room who had to prove he belonged twice as hard as everyone else. "Mr. Turner," Whitfield said, turning directly toward him with a thin, knowing smile, "since you're on scholarship specifically through our diversity initiative, perhaps you'd like to demonstrate to our guests exactly what that investment has produced." The room went uncomfortably quiet. A few students shifted in their seats. Malik felt the weight of dozens of eyes turning toward him, though his expression remained calm, betraying nothing of the sharp, familiar sting settling in his chest. "I'll attempt it, Professor," Malik said evenly, rising from his seat without hesitation. Whitfield's smile widened, clearly enjoying himself. "By all means, take your time. We have all afternoon to watch you try." Malik walked slowly to the front of the hall, picked up a single piece of chalk, and studied the equation for a long, silent moment. They had no idea what that quiet junior was about to do to 15 years of Professor Whitfield's carefully built reputation. The night before, in a modest apartment 3 miles from campus, Malik Turner had sat cross-legged on his bedroom floor, a worn leather notebook open across his lap, its pages soft and yellowed with age. The notebook had belonged to his father, Elijah Turner, a brilliant mathematician who had died when Malik was only 4 years old, under circumstances his mother rarely discussed in detail. A sudden illness, she always said, though something in her voice whenever the subject arose suggested a deeper, more complicated grief than illness alone could explain. Elijah had been a graduate student at this very university decades earlier, working under a legendary mentor whose name still appeared on department plaques throughout the mathematics building. Malik's mother, Denise, had raised him alone on a nurse's modest salary, working double shifts for years to keep him in strong schools, always encouraging his early fascination with numbers, always telling him, quietly and firmly, that his father would have been endlessly proud of the mind he was building. She had given him Elijah's notebook on his 16th birthday, explaining simply that it contained his father's unfinished work, dense pages of elegant, unconventional proofs that Malik had spent years slowly working to understand, page by careful page, without ever fully grasping their larger purpose. She rarely spoke about the university itself, though Malik had noticed, over the years, a faint tightness in her expression whenever the subject of his father's old graduate program came up in conversation, as though some old wound remained carefully guarded beneath her otherwise steady composure. He had chosen to attend this same university anyway, drawn partly by a scholarship offer he couldn't refuse, and partly by a quiet, unspoken hope that walking the same halls his father once walked might eventually help him understand a piece of his own history he'd never been able to fully access. Tonight, preparing for another ordinary day of coursework, Malik had found himself once again drawn to a particular page near the notebook's end, a half-finished proof, abandoned mid-thought, surrounded by his father's small, careful annotations questioning an assumption Malik had never seen addressed anywhere in his current coursework. He had no idea, closing the notebook and setting it gently on his nightstand that night, that the very equation his father had left unfinished decades earlier was about to be placed directly in front of him the next afternoon, framed as a cruel bet meant to humiliate him in front of an entire lecture hall. The university's mathematics department occupied one of campus's oldest and most prestigious buildings, its main lecture hall lined with dark wood paneling and formal portraits of past department chairs stretching back over a century. Brass plaques near the entrance listed the names of wealthy donors whose contributions had funded the building's recent renovations, their generosity permanently etched into the very walls where students now studied. The hall itself held nearly 200 seats, arranged in steep, formal tiers facing a wide chalkboard and lectern positioned beneath a stained-glass skylight that cast soft, colored light across the room during afternoon lectures. It was widely considered one of the most demanding and prestigious courses in the department's curriculum, drawing the university's most ambitious mathematics students each semester. That particular afternoon, the hall held an unusually formal energy as a visiting delegation from the university's donor relations office sat in reserved front row seats, there specifically to observe Professor Whitfield's celebrated teaching style ahead of an upcoming fundraising campaign built partly around his reputation as the department's most brilliant and demanding instructor. Whitfield had built his entire academic identity around his so-called signature equation, a complex problem he presented each semester as the ultimate test of a student's abilities, one he proudly claimed no student in 15 years of teaching had ever successfully solved without significant guidance from him personally. It was into this carefully performed atmosphere of academic prestige and donor spectacle that Whitfield had chosen to stage his cruel, theatrical bet, entirely unaware of the quiet, extraordinary connection sitting in the third row of his own celebrated classroom. He had no idea how completely this performance was about to collapse in front of the very donors he had hoped to impress. The mockery had begun subtly, weeks before that afternoon's dramatic bet, Though Malik had grown accustomed to absorbing it quietly rather than escalating conflicts, he knew he couldn't win from his position in the department. "Mr. Turner, perhaps you should sit closer to the front," Whitfield had said during an earlier lecture, his tone dripping with false concern, "given how often you seem to need extra time catching up on the material." Malik had never once needed extra time. His coursework consistently ranked among the strongest in the program, though Whitfield rarely acknowledged this, instead offering backhanded comments that positioned Malik's presence in the honors program as a kind of charitable accommodation rather than an earned achievement. A few classmates had noticed the pattern too, though most stayed quiet, unwilling to risk their own standing with a professor known for holding grudges against students who challenged him. One classmate, a sophomore named Trevor, had once whispered to a friend during a study session that Whitfield clearly didn't think the scholarship kids belonged here, a comment that had reached Malik secondhand, confirming a suspicion he'd carried quietly for over a year. That afternoon, as Whitfield issued his public bet in front of the visiting donors, the mockery finally crossed fully into humiliation, performed loudly enough that the entire lecture hall understood exactly what message was being sent. That Malik's presence in this room was, in Whitfield's mind, an experiment rather than an achievement. What Whitfield didn't notice, caught up in his own theatrical confidence, was that his teaching assistant, Priya Sharma, standing quietly near the side of the chalkboard, had gone very still, her expression tightening with something that looked distinctly like recognition rather than simple discomfort. That small detail, a teaching assistant's sudden stillness near the chalkboard, would become the first crack in Professor Whitfield's entire afternoon. This was not the first time Professor Whitfield had used his position to undermine students he considered beneath the department's traditional standards, and it would not have been the last had the wrong student not happened to be sitting in his classroom that particular semester. 2 years earlier, a brilliant first-generation college student named Marcus Delgado had been quietly steered out of the honors track after Whitfield repeatedly suggested, in private advising sessions, that Marcus's background made the advanced coursework an unnecessary strain better suited to students with stronger academic preparation, despite Marcus's consistently excellent grades. The previous year, a talented black graduate student named Aisha Coleman had approached Whitfield about serving as her dissertation advisor, only to be told, with practiced diplomatic vagueness, that her research interests didn't quite align with his current focus, despite the significant overlap in their work. Aisha eventually left the program entirely, unable to secure comparable mentorship elsewhere in the department. And for years, department scuttlebutt had quietly circulated about the origins of Whitfield's celebrated signature equation. Rumors that suggested his early breakthrough decades earlier had built upon foundational work from a graduate student who had mysteriously left the program before completing his own doctorate, though no one currently in the department seemed to know the full story, or particularly wanted to ask. Each of these incidents, taken alone, might have seemed like an isolated professional disagreement. Taken together, they formed a quiet, decades-long pattern that had allowed one man's reputation to grow steadily more untouchable, while the students and colleagues who crossed his path simply disappeared from the department's records, their contributions quietly folded into someone else's more celebrated legacy. Dean Harold Voss, who oversaw the mathematics department and had cultivated a close personal and financial relationship with Whitfield over the years through the professor's considerable fundraising connections, had quietly closed several formal complaints regarding Whitfield's treatment of minority students, citing differences in academic philosophy rather than any genuine pattern of discrimination. Malik Turner, standing now at the front of the lecture hall with a single piece of chalk in his hand, was about to become the student whose quiet, patient talent finally forced this buried pattern into the light. Priya Sharma had worked as Whitfield's teaching assistant for nearly 2 years, carefully managing the delicate balance between supporting struggling students and maintaining the professional relationship necessary to complete her own doctoral research under his department's broader supervision. She had watched Malik's quiet brilliance develop over those 2 years with genuine, growing admiration, recognizing in his careful, methodical approach to difficult proof something that reminded her, oddly, of research she had once encountered buried deep in the department's historical archives while researching her own dissertation on the mathematics department's institutional history. During the brief tension before Malik approached the chalkboard, Priya crossed quietly to where he stood, gathering his composure. "Malik," she said, keeping her voice low enough that only he could hear, "I need to tell you something before you start. Years ago, there was a graduate student in this department named Elijah Turner. I found references to his early work while researching department archives last year. I never made the connection until just now, watching you." Malik's breath caught sharply. "That was my father." Priya's eyes widened with sudden, stunned understanding. "Malik, I think Professor Whitfield's signature equation might not be entirely his own work. I tried researching it further months ago, but the department's older records are incomplete, and I never had enough evidence to raise it formally. I need you to know that you're not walking into this equation blind. You might already understand pieces of it your father worked on decades before either of us were born." She didn't know it yet, but her hurried, whispered revelation was about to give Malik exactly the confidence and context he needed for what happened next. And her own quiet research, buried for months, was finally about to matter. Whitfield's patience, thin from the moment he'd issued his theatrical bet, sharpened into something crueler as Malik studied the equation in silence. "Take all the time you need, Mr. Turner," he said, his voice carrying easily across the hall, clearly performing for the watching donors. "Though, I should mention, if you fail to make meaningful progress within the next few minutes, we'll need to discuss whether the honors program remains the appropriate placement for you going forward." A ripple of uncomfortable murmurs moved through the students. Priya, standing near the side of the room, stiffened visibly at the open threat. "Professor, that seems like an unusual condition to attach to a classroom demonstration," she said carefully, though her voice trembled slightly with the effort of speaking up. "I don't recall asking for input from my teaching assistant," Whitfield snapped, not even glancing in her direction, his attention fixed entirely on Malik and the watching donors. "This is precisely the kind of rigor that separates our program from lesser institutions, Miss Sharma. If Mr. Turner truly earned his place here, he should have no difficulty demonstrating it right now." Malik remained silent at the chalkboard, his eyes moving carefully across the dense equation, his mind quietly working through the strange, sudden clarity Priya's whispered revelation had unlocked, recognizing, with growing certainty, the exact unfinished proof from his father's old notebook embedded within Whitfield's supposedly original work. He picked up the chalk and began writing, his hand steady, his expression calm despite the threat still hanging heavy in the room. But Whitfield had no idea that Priya, moments earlier, had already sent an urgent message through the university's official research integrity reporting channel, flagging her long-buried suspicions about the equation's true origins. The call had already been made, and it was about to reach someone with the authority to finally investigate what the department had quietly ignored for years. What Professor Whitfield did not know, what almost no one in that lecture hall knew, was that Priya Sharma had spent the better part of the previous year quietly researching the department's institutional archives for her own dissertation, uncovering fragmentary references to a promising graduate student named Elijah Turner who had abruptly left the doctoral program decades earlier under circumstances the department's official records described only vaguely as voluntary withdrawal. Priya had found something else buried deep in those archives months earlier. An unpublished, handwritten manuscript submitted by Elijah Turner to his faculty committee just months before his sudden departure, containing early foundational work astonishingly similar to portions of Whitfield's later celebrated equation. She had never been able to definitively connect the two documents, lacking clear evidence of exactly how Whitfield, then a junior faculty member working under the same mentor as Elijah, might have accessed the manuscript. Her urgent message, flagged through the university's Research Integrity Office, had reached Provost Diane Ashford within minutes, given the serious nature of a potential plagiarism allegation involving one of the university's most prominent and financially valuable faculty members. Provost Ashford had immediately contacted the department's chief archivist, requesting the original Elijah Turner manuscript be retrieved from storage and brought to the lecture hall immediately. understanding that whatever was unfolding in Whitfield's classroom needed direct, real-time verification. Dean Voss, informed simultaneously of the unfolding situation, had attempted to intervene quietly through his usual channels, only to discover that Provost Ashford, positioned above him in the university's administrative hierarchy and unburdened by Whitfield's fundraising relationships, had no interest in quietly managing the matter away. The truth about Elijah Turner's original, unfinished work had been sitting quietly in a department archive for over 2 decades, waiting for exactly this moment and exactly his son's presence in that very lecture hall to finally matter. The heavy doors at the back of the lecture hall opened just as Malik completed the equation's final line, the soft click of the latch carrying clearly through the room's tense silence. Every head turned. Provost Diane Ashford walked in first, her expression composed but carrying an unmistakable gravity, followed closely by the department's elderly chief archivist, carrying a sealed, acid-free folder cradled carefully against his chest. Whitfield, startled by the unexpected interruption during his carefully staged demonstration, straightened to the front of the hall. "Provost Ashford, this is an unusual time for a visit. We're in the middle of an important classroom exercise." "I'm aware," Ashford said, her voice carrying easily across the silent room as she approached the chalkboard, her eyes moving first to Malik's completed proof, then to Whitfield himself. "I received an urgent report just minutes ago regarding a potential integrity concern connected directly to your signature equation, Professor Whitfield." The visiting donors in the front row exchanged uncertain glances, sensing the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere. Whitfield's earlier confidence flickered visibly for the first time all afternoon. "I don't know what you've been told," he said carefully, "but I assure you, my work on this equation has been thoroughly vetted over the years." "Then you won't mind if we compare it directly to this," Ashford said, nodding to the archivist, who carefully opened the sealed folder to reveal a yellowed, handwritten manuscript, its pages covered in dense mathematical notation unmistakably similar to the proof Malik had just completed on the chalkboard. The room fell into stunned, disbelieving silence as students craned forward, sensing that whatever was happening now mattered far more than the theatrical bet that had begun the afternoon's lecture. "This manuscript," Provost Ashford said, holding it up for the room to see, "was submitted by a graduate student named Elijah Turner nearly 30 years ago, shortly before he abruptly withdrew from this department's doctoral program." She turned toward Malik, still standing quietly at the chalkboard, chalk dust still clinging faintly to his fingers. "Mr. Turner, I understand Elijah Turner was your father." "Yes," Malik said quietly, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "He died when I was 4. My mother always told me he left behind unfinished work he never got the chance to complete." "He didn't leave it unfinished by choice," Priya said, stepping forward, her voice trembling but clear. "I found records suggesting he was quietly pressured out of the program shortly after submitting this manuscript to his faculty committee, the same committee Professor Whitfield served on as a junior faculty member at the time." Whitfield's face had drained of color entirely, his earlier theatrical confidence completely gone. "This is a complete misunderstanding," he said quickly. "I built on foundational ideas that were part of the broader academic conversation at the time. That's how mathematics works. Nothing was stolen." "Then perhaps you can explain," Ashford said evenly, turning the manuscript's pages to a specific section, "why this handwritten proof, dated nearly 3 decades ago, contains the exact same foundational insight Mr. Turner just demonstrated on your chalkboard moments ago, an insight you've spent 15 years publicly claiming as entirely your own original breakthrough." Whitfield opened his mouth to respond, but no adequate explanation came. The room remained utterly silent, every eye moving between the yellowed manuscript, the fresh chalk marks on the board, and the calm, composed young man standing quietly between both pieces of evidence. "I didn't think anyone would ever connect it," Whitfield finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't think it mattered anymore." The unraveling that followed happened swiftly, in full view of the stunned lecture hall and the visiting donor delegation. "It mattered enormously," Provost Ashford said, her voice hardening. It mattered to Elijah Turner, whose promising career was quietly ended by this department decades ago. And it matters now to his son, whom you humiliated in front of this entire room today, apparently unaware that you were staging your cruel little wager directly on top of his own father's stolen legacy. Whitfield sank slowly into the chair behind the lecture podium. His earlier commanding presence completely collapsed. "I need to speak with University Council," he said weakly. "You'll have that opportunity," Ashford said, "though I should inform you that this university takes academic integrity violations of this magnitude extremely seriously, particularly when compounded by decades of documented pattern complaints regarding your treatment of minority students that Dean Voss's office has repeatedly and quietly dismissed." Dean Voss, who had arrived moments earlier attempting to manage the unfolding crisis, visibly paled at the mention of his own role in the pattern, several nearby faculty members turning toward him with newly skeptical expressions. The visiting donors, who had come specifically to observe Whitfield's celebrated teaching prowess, quietly gathered their belongings, several of them approaching Provost Ashford directly to express serious concern about the department's broader culture rather than the fundraising campaign they had originally come to support. Priya stepped quietly to Malik's side, offering a small, encouraging smile as the department's institutional foundations continued crumbling around them. "Your father's work finally got the recognition it always deserved," she said softly. "You did that just by walking up to that chalkboard." 6 months later, the university's mathematics department operated under an entirely reformed leadership structure, following Professor Whitfield's formal termination and a university-wide review that ultimately led to Dean Voss's resignation as well. Both departures covered extensively in academic publications nationwide. The department formally and publicly credited Elijah Turner as the true originator of what had once been known as Whitfield's signature equation, renaming it the Turner-Whitfield theorem in recognition of both men's contributions. Elijah's foundational insight and the additional formal work Whitfield had genuinely completed afterward, work that, stripped of its stolen foundation, still represented a meaningful, if far more modest, academic contribution. A newly established scholarship, the Elijah Turner Memorial Fund, now provides full tuition support for promising minority students entering the university's honors mathematics program. Funded partly through a formal settlement the university reached with Malik and his mother in recognition of decades of overdue acknowledgement. Priya Sharma completed her doctoral dissertation, expanded significantly to include the full historical account of Elijah Turner's buried contribution, and was subsequently hired as an assistant professor within the very department that had once nearly erased his legacy entirely, now committed to mentoring students the way she wished someone had mentored Elijah decades earlier. Malik graduated with highest honors the following spring, accepting a full doctoral fellowship in his father's memory. His late father's worn notebook now displayed carefully in a small glass case near the department's entrance, alongside a photograph of Elijah as a young graduate student and a brief plaque explaining the truth the university had waited far too long to acknowledge. "My father never got to finish his equation," Malik said at the scholarship's inaugural ceremony, standing at the very chalkboard where his own quiet demonstration had finally forced the truth into the light. "But I got to finish it for him. And now, so will everyone this scholarship helps after me." His mother, Denise, sat in the front row that day, holding the same worn notebook Malik had first opened at 16, her eyes glistening with a grief that had finally found something like peace after nearly 3 decades of quiet, unresolved waiting. She had never expected to see her husband's name spoken aloud in that department again, let alone etched permanently into its history beside the very theorem that had once been used to erase him. Have you ever seen someone's talent or contribution quietly erased simply because of who they were? What would you have done sitting in that lecture hall? Drop your answer in the comments below. Like, share, and subscribe for more real stories about dignity, justice, and the quiet power of people who are underestimated.